without a mandate, having that official authority of being someone's manager is a really key component to becoming a great product manager. What we're going to focus on today is managing your day-to-day team and talking about who that usually is and what kind of things you should look out for. We'll also talk about setting you and your team up for success, managing stakeholders and executives, working with other product managers, and figuring out your leadership stuff. So skipping over, we'll skip this leading without a mandate part, but let's focus in on managing your day-to-day team. So day-to-day, at a minimum, most product teams will have engineers and designers. I've been on teams where there's just one engineer, one designer, and me. I've been on teams where I've had 8 engineers, 2 different designers, and managing that, as well as managing multiple teams of engineers and designers. But at a minimum, these are the people you're going to work with on a day-to-day basis. Some other roles, depending on the type of organization you're in, might be QA. And so people really focused on making sure the quality of the product you're building is great. Data scientists can be a big part. I've worked on a lot of like machine learning, LLM products, as well as like data platforms. So that's been a big role I've worked with as well. We also might be working with sales teams, account management, right? But usually these are most of the roles that you'll see on a day-to-day that you'll have to work with. So key delineations. As a product manager, your key job is to find the problem. So the who plus what. And the problem versus solution part, I go deeper into this. But basically, is really saying like, this is the problem I'm solving, and this is the person who we're solving it for. Depending on what, if you're B2B or B2C, that'll be your customer segment. That'll be the type of customers, depending on how like the organization is delineated between different parts of the product. But that's really important to know. And then you facilitate finding the ideal solution by providing as much context as possible to your team. I think a lot of times, it used to be described product as a CEO of a product, but really you're there to facilitate. You're there to give people the context from user research, from really understanding the problem that you're solving, from what's needed from a business standpoint to help facilitate the design and engineering components to figure out what solutions make sense. And so design really ideates and crafts solutions based on their design, UI, UX expertise. Design is interesting because there's different roles. So some people might be more visual designers, some people might be more like UX, so UX, really the UI and how those customers' interactions go. I've worked with a lot of product designers who do all of the above, but really they're focused on crafting that solution based off like their design expertise. And engineering ideates and crafts solutions based off their technical knowledge. So what is your current product capable of? How long will it take to implement one solution versus another? What will be the consequences? Will be tech debt, right? So again, when you're in this conversation, when you're facilitating these conversations, design is coming with their expertise, engineers coming with their expertise, and you're coming with the knowledge of what the problem is you have to solve, and you facilitate finding the best solution given all of the expertise. Now, collaboration and communication. This is a key component of managing a day-to-day team. My big advice for this, 3 points. 1, keep it constant and manageable. The worst thing you can do is have people be out of the loop, because then you spend more time catching everyone up than getting to the actual thing you want to solve. It could be different for each team. If you follow like a agile cadence, usually have sprint, and you'll have your consistent like sprint ceremonies where you might do it. If you're doing more of a Kanban, you might have to create just a weekly kickoff. It doesn't really matter what it is. It just needs to be consistent and manageable for your team. And when I say manageable, if you're working at a small startup where there's only 20 employees and you are doing data analytics, user research, also thinking about the product, think about what's actually manageable. Is daily stand-up where you keep it a tight 15 and you just give a little bit more context every day manageable for you? Or can you afford a full meeting? Versus like if you're a large company like Meta or Netflix, you probably have a little bit more time to set aside like more scheduled meetings across your team. But again, just make sure it's manageable. Second thing is making sure everyone understands their role. This is a big source of issues and conflict, I think, with a lot of teams. One thing that I think we all forget is although you might have the title of product or engineer or design, that can be very different at each company you've worked at. So it's really important that when you go into a new team or a new organization, that everyone understands what their role is and understands not just how they contribute, but under expectations of how others contribute as well. And finally, make sure to clear how decisions are made. This is also a big key issue. And also make sure it's consistent with how you say they're made. So, right, a lot of companies will have processes that they put in place that is not actually how decisions are made. And so you really want to make sure that your team understands the context of those decisions so you get less conflict down the road. Before I move to the next part, any questions about anything I've said so far or just thoughts? All right. So now we're going to zoom in on a key part around managing conflict. Inevitably, there will be conflict. If there's more than two people in a room, sometimes even one in a room, there's going to be conflict. And so when you build product with people, you want to make sure you have tools to really understand. So I want to kind of walk through a couple of common examples that happen and how you might think about them. So one is engineers not wanting to do a task. I've been in that situation a lot where an engineer doesn't want to do the task that's needed, and there's various reasons why. I've also been in where there's conflict between team members around how something should get done, versus how we've already agreed how it should get done. Someone makes a mistake or doesn't do their job. That's a really big one. Again, we're all kind of responsible for the outcomes. But sometimes the special product is held more accountable because they're the most visible part of the team. And so oftentimes if someone makes a mistake or doesn't do their part, that can result in conflict. And finally, we get an unexpected bad result. And so you go in with all the best intentions and then something really bad happens. So I can walk you through an example of one of these things that I've seen in the past. So a couple years ago, I was working at an organization, and I actually had scheduled a 3-week vacation that I was really excited about. And right before my vacation, they decided to do a round of mass layoffs, which completely changed our entire product roadmap because we had a different team and much less resources. And so I had to get in the room with all of our engineers and designers and talk through like, hey, I know we had this plan about how we were going to move forward, but given everything that just happened and our new focus as an organization to focus on profitability and streamlining, we need to change our roadmap. And I explained that, this is something we would normally do. We wouldn't just like completely change the roadmap in a day, but given the context that we were in, it's really important that we do so. And so I started by making sure everyone understood the context of why we were in the room and the context of what the goals of what decisions we need to drive towards. So we spent about like 4 or 5 hours in the room figuring things out. We also had a big new feature in play that would be like, that was a data analytics around, it was a texting organization. And so there was a lot of data analytics we were going to put around the success of these text campaigns that was coming out that we were kind of midway through building out. So set everything up, go on vacation, I come back and I realized that the designer I've been working with added some scope creep because she didn't realize the complexity of some of the calculations she put on the wireframes. And my VP of engineering was very frustrated because it was taking longer than possible. And he felt like the scope creep was happening. And I just got back from 3 weeks on vacation. So I didn't really want to deal with it. And also didn't know why those decisions were getting made. So I came into a very tense situation where we had to bring in our VP of data and some of the executive team because the project wasn't going as planned. And design engineering were kind of at each other's throats. And I made it clear that I'm very aware of all of your capability. And like, I'm not coming in here as someone to try to judge who did something bad or good. I believe that you all have extraordinary talent and you're able to do what you do. I just don't understand how we got to where we were because I was on vacation. So I need you all to walk me through how this decision was made. And as we walked through the decisions, it became clear that there was a lot of little misunderstandings that kind of all got conflated towards the end. And once we kind of talked through that and managed that, we figured out how to deprioritize some of the changes and just extend out the final completion of the feature, but still be on time with the stuff we originally committed to. And so in that situation, it was really important to not only set the context for people for why the conflict or for why we were having kind of hard discussions, but to make sure everyone understood that they were like appreciated and that the focus was not on who was to blame, but the focus is on how do we get to a solution that we all can agree and move forward with. All right, so that's just a little bit of the course. And I think what's up for Q&A now.
I'm wondering, Victoria, did you have those conversations in person or were you navigating them over Zoom and remotely?
So I had those conversations in person.
And have you found a difference in managing product teams since going, are you remote now or since you've been remote or in person?
Yeah. So the last product, like day-to-day product role I had was we actually had a fully remote team, and I've done like remote and distributed teams most of my career. And then of course with the start of COVID, we moved into like fully remote. I think the difference, I do think it's important to be in person some of the time to build the initial relationship. And so when I've ever been in remote teams, we usually have at least once a quarter where all, if not most of the team, most, if not all of the team meets in person, because you just can't establish like that initial just like trust. It's really hard to do it over Zoom, and it can take a long time. And so that's always been really key. But then once you have that kind of, couple days in person and get to just know each other, it's usually easier to then manage most of the things on Zoom. And what I will say about Zoom is like, it actually helps keep things confined, because when people are just sitting in a room or sitting in an office, right, conversation can just linger and start, versus like, okay, with Zoom, we have to like plan to do something and like plan to time box it. And so it usually keeps things a little bit more structured. But yeah, it does sometimes make it harder to build that initial trust and foundation. And then Brian, you said not managing a team currently, but you were a principal PM mentoring others and helping to grow the team.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have any questions about their specific roles in their product team, and then or relationships they have with other members of the team? No questions?
Hey, Victoria. Yeah, I have a question. But when it comes to, a de-escalation or diffusing tension in a team, because I've noticed that, in the past, there's always some kind of this over lingering tension between, either whether it's business, product, or engineering. There's always this like diffusion that's happening between those three elements. How do you sort of do you have any tactics or strategies on how to sort of lower that friction, and how do you actually become a sort of like a better communicator and actually like let stakeholders know that, hey, this is happening, we can't meet all your needs, right? Because our main goal is to actually serve our customers more than anything else, right? And if it helps the customers and it helps the business, it's a win-win. How do you sort of communicate that in a very gentle manner without, getting tensed up about it?
I think you're muted, Victoria.
I am. So I would say it depends, but not as like a cop out, but as like a real, like, the basic point is that you're dealing with people, and part of your job as a product person, to understand the type of people you're dealing with, right? And so in the general rule I always find to be the most helpful in de-escalation is not, again, focusing on who's to blame or who did what. It's what is our goal for the situation and how do we get there effectively together. That usually kind of decreases some of the tension, because if people go into a conversation talking about who's to blame or who's whatever, like whose fault it was, that's where most of that tension and derailment goes of conversations. But when I say what's important, right, you need to understand, again, going back to how decisions are made, what is the motivation of their stakeholders? Are they trying to impress the executive team with how their team is doing, and what you're doing might be in conflict with that? An example of this, when I first started at an organization, most of the people there had backgrounds in like the nonprofit and political campaign backgrounds, which is great because that's what we focused on. But they didn't understand how products are built. So they didn't understand that you needed to use research. And when I tried to talk to customers, the account management team was like, whoa, you're stepping on our turf. We're trying to talk to customers. You're going to confuse them, blah, blah, blah. And so I had to understand, like, oh, when I say certain things about wanting to reach out to customers, which again, from every organization I've been in before, is a very normal thing to do, they didn't have the same context as I did. So for them, it was seen as like not undermining them. But once I understood that, I could then talk to them like, hey, this is why user research is so important. And this is how I want to bring you in on. I want to be additive to what you're doing as a team. And I want to make sure I not only make you look better as an account manager by doing the research I'm doing, by building trust, telling them the value of how it builds trust with customers, how it helps customers understand, like they can get feedback and see that feedback happen and come into the product in real time. And so that's often the issue too, when you have that conflict, is like you don't actually know where other people are coming from, why engineering might be saying the things they're doing, or design, or whatever stakeholders you have. And so that's why I think it's a really important, it depends. Because if you know their motivations and their why, you can structure the conversation most of the time to make sure the goals that you're looking to push forward actually align with what their goals are as well.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, I think you made a really good point at the end, which is about understanding their motivations more than anything else, because I think it's quite easy to sometimes forget about the mission of the team, and we're all on the same side. We're not actually trying to argue or bicker or against each other, but we're all on the same team, and we all have the same mission in mind, and we're all sort of trying to help out our core customers more than anything else. So wonderful.
Exactly.
I feel like this was sort of touched on in your last answer, but something I've run into a lot is kind of the frustration that's built within the engineering team when leadership kind of redirects and changes milestones, and maybe people have been working on something that is now kind of obsolete or put on the back burner. I'm wondering how you handle like communicating that to the team without commiserating, but also, like you said, keeping people focused on like what the goal is and why we're making these changes and why we're doing what we're doing.
Sure. So two strategies I have for that in the past is one, I guess it's three. One, as soon as I hear a whiff of anything about like changing, actually kind of mention it. I already start mentioning it to the team. And this is like a judgment call, right? Because you don't want to do it too early because somebody gets there says something, they never say it again. But if it's something that you're starting to hear or you think might gain traction, I just kind of say like, hey, this isn't final yet, but people are thinking about this. Because you never want a final decision to come with completely no warning. So that's one thing I do. Two, on the like kind of proactive side with the kind of stakeholders who are determining this, helping them to understand how this affects the team. So, if they're trying to do make some changes, I'm very clear about like, hey, if you make those changes, this is affect what's currently happening. So like, this is a swapper in place. So if you want to swap that out, that's fine, but just be clear that you're swapping this out and that like our goals are this, and it may or may not align. And so like, I try to map out that whole picture. So like, it forces them to really think about the changes they're trying to make before they try to make this happen. Depending on your level of seniority and like kind of your relationship with your executive team, I've also been able to just be like, no, we're not doing that. But that might not always be like your ability to do so. And so when you get to that point, then it's just having a conversation with the team where it's more like, I'm trying to figure out the right phrasing for it, but empathetic clarity, basically just being like, hey, I understand how this like affects you. I understand that this is not ideal, but this is the situation that we're in. And this is why we're going to do it, and try to, again, give them as much context as possible. And usually like people might still be mad, but then their anger just dissipates and you're not really responsible for that. You're responsible for making it clear to them why things are happening. And when there's resistance to it, again, like, and I don't talk about it much here, but that's why I really think it's important to make sure you have your team think about how we're all accountable and responsible for the end product. Because if you have that, it's not always just you having a conversation. Then you can work with your lead engineer to also be like, yeah, like, this sucks, but this is what we're doing. And it's not just always on you. And you kind of have that group to come together and say like, hey, like, this is not ideal, but like, this is what we're doing going forward.
Totally. Yeah, that's super insightful of how to handle kind of both branches of that issue.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're mostly just managing a lot of people.
Yeah.
Who don't report to you.
Yeah.
In your slides, Victoria, you mentioned you've got to make it clear to your team how decisions are made. I'm curious whether you could share some examples of how you've made decisions in different companies in the past, like whether it's the leadership telling you as a product team, this is how the organization makes decisions, or whether you had that autonomy in your role as a product lead to say, this is how we're going to do this for the team.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's been like kind of different at each organization that I've been in. My big push always is to like try to make sure that our product teams, whether I'm like kind of running one day to day or more like managing various teams, that they have like a clear autonomous path. Because the real issue, especially as products get more complicated, is that what one team does then really affects what the other team does, or like someone makes a code change and it affects what you were doing. And that can cause a lot of issues. And so if teams are like mostly autonomous, then you get to be like, okay, the business does yearly or quarterly planning. These are our company OKRs, our company goals, our company whatever metrics, right? And then from those, making sure that like what we're doing lines up to that. So it's like, hey, so we've decided this year our goal is really focused on retention, and we want to make sure that, you know, right now we're at like 10% churn and we want to get down to 5% churn. And so when we talk to like when we think about a product team and like what we're focusing on, it's like, okay, how does what we do affect that churn? So what customers are experiencing that churn? What can we do to optimize that? And that's like really driving our goals. So making sure like it aligns up to the business goals again. So it's making sure there's a shared context as to why. And then for the teams itself, in terms of like how we make decisions as a team, I do a big thing, which I talk about in the course, which is having a shared working agreement. So before, like whenever I join a new team or a new organization, I make sure to kind of create a shared working agreement. So that includes everything from like what's our meeting cadence, how do we want to like, you know, deal with conflict, how do we make sure everyone knows what each other's roles are, but also a big part of that is how decisions are made. So understanding like, hey, like this is how we'll have stories in the roadmap. This is what a story should include, right? Because again, unfortunately, that differs for every team. Some people really want like a drawn out detailed story. Other people can put it on a post note and be fine, just have a conversation, right? But you make that working agreement so everyone's a part of that decision. And again, it's a delicate balance, right? Because it's not really a meritocracy kind of vibe. It's more of like a we all share, and then the people in leadership positions like, okay, this is like based on what we're hearing, this is like what makes the most sense. And it doesn't necessarily match everything everyone wanted, but it's probably 80-20 on what it needs to be.
That makes sense. Thank you. We have a couple of minutes here. Does anyone have a final question? If not, we will wrap up and I will send the recording around to everybody.
I think the one last question that I had was, especially with like design and engineering teams that you work with as a PM, sometimes there's always an ask for like prioritizing like tech debt or design debt in sense. So like, how do you work with those parts of your team and like have that? And I think those are like confidence boosters for both sides. Like they want to be able to work on those debts. Like, how do you work with prioritizing those and letting them know if it's able to, you know, be part of the roadmap, or if it's not able to be part of the roadmap?
So with things like tech debt, instead of letting them kind of build up to be these giant things to chip at, like I usually try to make it part of our regular sprint cadence. And so I make sure engineering keeps a backlog of like what tech debt decisions that we've made. And then we pull in one or two every sprint, unless something's happening, but try to make it kind of like a regular maintenance issue instead of like, you know, kind of like cleaning your house. Instead of waiting till it's like absolutely disgusting and then, you know, figure it out. Like, how can I just like make sure I always put away my clothes and always do this? And that's really helped it to not become like this huge issue, but just a regular part of maintenance. Now you do have the times where like something, you know, has like creates a lot of tech debt, or maybe like unintentionally creates a lot of tech debt. And then you have to figure out like a time to do it. But like that's been the best way I've kept it from being like a point of contention. Something you also want to think about as well is sometimes I think tech debt gets mislabeled, right? Where it's like, hey, we made a decision to do this like MVP of a feature that doesn't like quite scale. as we thought it would. And sometimes there's assumption that like it needs to scale that way. And so I think a lot about that when starting like a new big like project that will like fundamentally change the product. If there's any decisions about like how we are doing it MVP versus later, making sure that's a part of like the original project plan. So it's less seen as tech debt versus the evolution of the features of functionality and its ability to scale. So sometimes it's just like marketing, to be honest.
Right. That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Victoria, for this session. That was super
Thank you.
cool. I'll send around the recording. If you guys are interested in Victoria's course, the next cohort is kicking off in January. So make sure to go to the landing page and reserve your seat for the January cohort. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we will see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Victoria. Bye-bye.